So my cousin Derek works for the Bureau of Land Management, and he told me this story about 3 years ago when we were both pretty drunk at a family barbecue. I've been thinking about it ever since, especially after some of the stuff that's been in the news lately about UAPs and all that. Derek's not the type to make things up, he's probably the most straightforward guy I know, works outdoors, doesn't even watch science fiction movies because he thinks they're stupid. Which is why what he told me that night has stuck with me. This happened back in 2019, late September. Derek was doing a routine survey in the Bridger-Teton National Forest in Wyoming, way out near the Continental Divide where you won't see another human being for days. The BLM was updating their wildlife migration maps, so he was out there alone for 2 weeks with just his truck, camping gear, and a bunch of trail cameras to set up. Derek actually liked these solo assignments, said it was peaceful, gave him time to think. His wife had just had their second kid, and I think he appreciated the quiet. The area he was working was this high alpine meadow system, probably around 9,000 feet elevation, surrounded by these massive granite peaks. Beautiful country, but remote as hell. The nearest town was maybe 60 miles away, and that was just a gas station and a diner. Derek told me he'd been out there 4 days already, setting up cameras along game trails, when he started noticing things were off. First thing was the silence. Derek grew up hunting and camping, so he knows what normal forest quiet sounds like. But this was different. Usually you'll hear birds, squirrels, maybe an elk bugling in the distance. This was like someone had turned the volume down on everything. Even the wind seemed muted. He said it reminded him of that dead quiet you get right before a big thunderstorm, except there were clear skies. The wildlife was acting strange too. Derek had been photographing elk sign all week, tracks, scat, rubs on trees where the bulls had been marking territory. Then suddenly, nothing. Like every animal in a 10-mile radius had just vanished overnight. The trail cameras he'd already set up weren't picking up anything either, which was weird because that area should have been thick with deer and elk preparing for winter migration. Derek's not superstitious, but he started getting this feeling like he was being watched. You know that creepy sensation when the hair on the back of your neck stands up? He kept finding himself looking over his shoulder, scanning the tree line. A couple times he thought he saw movement in his peripheral vision, but when he turned to look directly, there was nothing there. Just shadows and pine branches swaying in the breeze. On the 5th night, Derek was sitting by his campfire, updating his field notes, when he heard this sound. He described it as almost like whale song, but higher pitched and coming from somewhere up in the sky. Not a bird, he knew every bird call in that region. This was something else entirely. Long, modulated tones that seemed to echo off the mountain faces. The sound lasted maybe 30 seconds, then stopped as abruptly as it had started. Derek sat there listening for another hour, but it didn't happen again. He told himself it was probably just wind blowing through some rock formation he wasn't familiar with, but he didn't really believe it. The sound had been too organized, too purposeful. Too much like communication. That's when things started getting really weird. The next morning, Derek was hiking up to place a camera near a natural salt lick when he found the first circle. Burned into the grass in a perfect ring, maybe 20 feet across. The grass inside the circle was completely dead, not just brown, but gray and brittle like it had been flash frozen and then cooked. The edges were so clean and precise it looked like someone had used a massive compass to draw it. Derek took photos, collected some of the dead grass for samples. He'd never seen anything like it. Forest fires don't burn in perfect circles, and there was no evidence of any human activity in the area. No tire tracks, no footprints, nothing. Just this perfect dead circle in the middle of an otherwise healthy meadow. He found 2 more circles over the next few days, all roughly the same size, all with that same crispy gray grass. One was on a hillside that would have been impossible to access with any kind of vehicle. Derek started feeling genuinely uneasy. The rational part of his brain kept trying to come up with explanations: underground gas pockets, some kind of fungal infection, freak lightning strikes. But none of it really made sense. That's when the light started. Derek first saw them on his 8th night in the field. He'd been having trouble sleeping anyway because of the unnatural quiet, so he was lying in his tent around 2 a.m. when the inside of his tent lit up like someone had turned on a floodlight outside. But the light was wrong somehow, too white, too cold. Nothing like firelight or even a powerful LED flashlight. Derek unzipped his tent flap and stuck his head out. About 100 yards away, hovering maybe 50 feet above the tree line, was this light. Not a light attached to something, just a light, perfectly spherical, about the size of a basketball. It was so bright he could barely look directly at it, but it wasn't casting shadows the way a normal light source would. Everything around it was illuminated, but evenly, like the light was coming from everywhere at once. The light hung there for maybe 2 minutes, perfectly still, then suddenly shot straight up and disappeared. No sound, no trail, just gone. Derek sat there staring at the empty sky, his heart hammering. He'd never seen anything move that fast, not even a military jet. He didn't sleep the rest of that night. The next day, Derek found the first set of marks. He was checking one of his trail cameras when he noticed these impressions in the soft earth nearby. 3 circular depressions, each about 6 inches across, arranged in a perfect triangle. They were pressed deep into the ground, like something incredibly heavy had landed there. But there were no footprints leading to or from the marks, no disturbance in the surrounding area. Derek measured the marks, took photos from every angle. The soil inside each depression was compressed to the point where it was almost like concrete. He tried to dig into one with his knife, but the blade barely scratched the surface. Whatever had made those marks had exerted enormous pressure. That's when Derek started feeling like he needed to get out of there. The logical part of his brain was telling him to document everything, collect evidence, file a proper report. But his gut was screaming at him to pack up and leave. The feeling of being watched had gotten stronger, more oppressive. Sometimes he'd catch glimpses of movement in the sky, just quick flashes that could have been birds, but were too fast and moved in ways that didn't seem right. Derek decided to compromise. He'd pack up most of his gear and move his camp closer to the road, but he'd leave a few cameras running to see if he could capture whatever was going on. He spent most of the day breaking down his campsite, but he wanted to retrieve one last camera he'd placed near a creek about a mile away. The hike to the camera took him through a dense stand of lodgepole pines, the kind of forest where the trees grow so close together they block out most of the sunlight. Derek was maybe halfway there when he realized he wasn't alone. There was something moving parallel to him through the trees, matching his pace perfectly. Derek would stop, and the movement would stop. He'd start walking again, and it would resume. He never got a clear look at whatever it was, just occasional glimpses of something pale moving between the tree trunks. Derek's military training kicked in. He found a large pine to put his back against and pulled out his binoculars, scanning the forest methodically. For several minutes he didn't see anything. Then, about 60 yards away, something stepped into a small clearing. Derek still has trouble describing what he saw. It was vaguely humanoid, maybe 7 feet tall, but wrong in ways that made his brain hurt to process. The proportions were off, arms too long, head too large, limbs that bent in directions that didn't match human anatomy. The skin looked almost translucent, with a gray-blue tint like skim milk. But the worst part was how it moved. Too fluid, like it wasn't quite subject to the same physical laws as everything else. The thing stood in the clearing for maybe 30 seconds, and Derek got the distinct impression it was looking right at him, even though he couldn't make out any facial features through the binoculars. Then it simply faded away. Not walked away, not moved behind a tree, faded, like a mirage dissolving. Derek didn't wait around to see if it would come back. He abandoned the camera and hiked as fast as he could back to his truck, threw his remaining gear in the bed, and drove straight out of the forest. He didn't stop until he hit the interstate, and even then he kept checking his rearview mirror. Derek filed his official report with the BLM, but he left out most of the weird stuff. Just documented the burned circles and the strange marks, listed them as unexplained geological phenomena requiring further investigation. He never went back to retrieve those cameras, and as far as I know, nobody else has been assigned to that area since. Derek's different now. Still does his job, still takes solo assignments, but he won't work anywhere near that part of Wyoming. Says he's got enough other territory to cover. When I asked him if he really thinks he saw aliens, he just shrugged and said it doesn't matter what he thinks, he knows what he saw, and that's enough. The thing is, I looked up that area on some UFO websites after Derek told me this story, and there have been reports from that region going back decades. Lights in the sky, missing time, cattle mutilations. All the classic stuff. Makes you wonder what else is out there that we just don't talk about. Derek made me promise not to tell anyone this story until after he retires. He's got 3 years left with the BLM, and he doesn't want to jeopardize his pension. But sometimes late at night, when I'm lying in bed, I think about him out there in that forest, being watched by something that shouldn't exist. And I wonder if it's still out there, waiting.
My old roommate Jake from college sent me this email about 6 months ago. Just showed up in my inbox with the subject line, "You're not going to believe this," and a wall of text that honestly made me worried about his mental state. Jake's always been a pretty level-headed guy. He's an accountant, for Christ's sake, so when he starts talking about seeing things that shouldn't exist, it gets your attention. Jake moved to Oregon after graduation, bought this little house about 10 miles inland from the coast near a town called Bandon. He works remotely now, so he figured why not live somewhere beautiful and cheap. The house came with about 5 acres of property, mostly forest, and Jake was excited about having space to spread out, maybe do some woodworking, grow a garden. Typical millennial homesteader fantasy. According to his email, everything was normal for the first few months. Jake was settling into small-town life, learning his neighbors' names, figuring out where to shop for groceries. The property was perfect. Mostly Douglas fir and cedar, with a small creek running through the back end. Peaceful and private, exactly what he'd been looking for. The weirdness started in late fall. Jake was working in his home office one evening when he heard this humming sound coming from outside. Low frequency, almost below the threshold of hearing, but strong enough that he could feel it in his chest. Kind of like standing next to a large electrical transformer, but much more subtle. Jake went outside to investigate, but he couldn't pinpoint where the sound was coming from. It seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at the same time. He walked around the property for about 20 minutes, but the humming faded away before he could locate the source. Jake figured it was probably some kind of industrial equipment from town, even though 10 miles seemed like a long way for sound to carry. The humming came back a few nights later, same time of evening, lasting about an hour. Then again a week after that. Jake started paying attention and he realized it was happening on a schedule every Tuesday and Friday night between 9 and 10 p.m. Like clockwork. Jake asked his nearest neighbor, an old guy named Carl who'd lived in the area for 30 years, if he'd ever noticed any strange sounds. Carl got this weird look on his face and asked Jake if he meant the humming. Turns out half the people in the area had heard it at one time or another, but nobody talked about it much. Carl said it had been going on for as long as he could remember, maybe longer. Just part of living out here, Carl told him. You get used to it. But Jake didn't get used to it. If anything, the sound started bothering him more as time went on. It would wake him up even when he was wearing earplugs, this deep thrumming that seemed to vibrate through the ground and into his bones. He started having trouble sleeping on Tuesday and Friday nights, lying awake waiting for it to start. That's when Jake noticed the lights. The first time was in December around 11 p.m. on a Friday. Jake was lying in bed, post-humming session, when his bedroom lit up with this pale blue glow. He thought maybe a neighbor was driving by with really bright headlights, but when he got up to look out the window, he saw something that made his blood run cold. Floating about 50 feet above his backyard was this disc-shaped object, maybe 30 feet across, glowing with that same blue light. It wasn't like a spotlight or anything mechanical. The whole thing was luminous, like it was made of light itself. It hovered there completely silently for maybe 5 minutes, then drifted away through the trees and disappeared. Jake stood at his window for another hour, but it didn't come back. He was shaking so hard he could barely hold his phone steady when he tried to take pictures, but of course by then there was nothing to photograph. The next morning, Jake found a perfect circle of dead grass in his backyard, right where the object had been hovering. The grass wasn't burned. It was bleached white, like all the chlorophyll had been sucked out of it. The circle was so precise it looked like someone had used a giant cookie cutter. Jake took photos of the dead circle, measured it, even collected some of the grass to examine under a magnifying glass. The blades looked normal except for the color, but they crumbled to dust when he touched them. Within a week, new grass started growing in the circle, but it grew in this weird spiral pattern instead of randomly like normal grass. The sightings became regular after that. Every few weeks, Jake would see lights moving through the forest behind his house. Sometimes they were the same blue glow, sometimes white or pale green. They moved too smoothly to be drones, too quietly to be helicopters. Jake started keeping a camera by his bed, but the lights never stayed in one place long enough for him to get a decent shot. Jake told me he became obsessed with documenting everything. He set up trail cameras around his property, started a journal, even bought one of those EMF detectors that ghost hunters use. The cameras never caught anything useful, just occasional bright flashes that washed out the image, or shots of empty forest with weird shadows that didn't match the surrounding trees. But the EMF detector went crazy during the humming sessions. Jake said the readings would spike so high they maxed out the device, and it would keep beeping and flashing until the humming stopped. The first direct encounter happened in March. Jake was working late in his home office when he heard a sound from the kitchen. Not the usual humming, but something like footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps on his hardwood floor. Jake grabbed a baseball bat and crept toward the kitchen, his heart pounding. The footsteps had stopped, but he could see a faint glow coming from around the corner. When he finally worked up the courage to look, there was something standing by his refrigerator. Jake's description in his email was pretty vague, but he said it was humanoid but clearly not human. Tall and thin, with skin that looked almost transparent. The glow was coming from within its body like it had some kind of internal light source. It was just standing there, motionless, facing the refrigerator. Jake stood frozen in the doorway for what felt like hours but was probably only a few seconds. Then the thing turned to look at him, and Jake said its eyes were like nothing he'd ever seen, not malicious or threatening, just completely alien. Ancient and intelligent, but totally without human emotion. They stared at each other for a moment that stretched into eternity. Then the being simply faded away like mist. 1 second it was there, solid and real. The next second Jake was staring at an empty kitchen. Jake called in sick the next day and drove to Portland, where he spent 3 days in a hotel trying to convince himself he'd had a breakdown or a really vivid dream. But when he came back home, there were these strange marks on his kitchen floor, not footprints exactly, but impressions in the wood like something incredibly hot had touched the surface without actually burning it. That's when Jake started researching the history of his property. He spent hours at the local library, going through old newspapers and county records. Turns out his land had a reputation going back to the 1800s. Native American tribes in the area had stories about sky people who would come down to hunt in the forests. Early settlers reported strange lights and missing livestock. In 1952, a family named the Kowalskis lived on Jake's property. According to newspaper reports, they abandoned their house overnight, leaving behind all their possessions and telling neighbors they'd seen devils made of light in their backyard. The house sat empty for 20 years before anyone else would buy it. Jake found similar stories about other properties in the area. People seeing lights, finding dead circles in their yards, reporting encounters with beings that didn't quite look human. But nobody ever talked about it openly. It was always whispered rumors, stories that got passed down but never officially recorded. The final incident happened just 2 weeks before Jake sent me his email. He woke up around 3 a.m. to find his bedroom filled with that familiar blue glow. But this time, the light was coming from inside his room. 3 of those beings were standing at the foot of his bed, just watching him. Jake said he tried to move, tried to speak, but his body wouldn't respond. He was completely paralyzed, but his mind was clear and alert. He could feel them studying him, not with their eyes but with something deeper, like they were reading his thoughts. The experience lasted maybe 10 minutes, though Jake said time felt distorted, like he was experiencing everything in slow motion. Then the beings faded away and Jake could move again. He immediately got up and turned on every light in the house, but they were gone. Jake found more of those heat impressions on his bedroom carpet, arranged in a pattern that looked almost like a geometric equation. He took photos, but they came out blurry and distorted, like the camera couldn't quite focus on the marks. That's when Jake decided he'd had enough. He put his house on the market the next week and moved back to California. Took a huge loss on the sale, but he said he didn't care. He just needed to get away from that place. The weird part is, Jake's email wasn't asking for advice or trying to convince me of anything. He just said he needed to tell someone who might believe him, and he figured I'd be open-minded enough to listen. He ended the email by saying he still hears the humming sometimes, even here in California, and he wonders if moving away was enough or if they'll follow him. I looked up Jake's old address on Google Earth just out of curiosity. The property looks normal from satellite view, just trees and a small house. But there are these perfect circles scattered throughout the forest, lighter patches where the vegetation is different. You'd never notice them unless you were specifically looking for them. Jake and I have exchanged a few more emails since then, but he doesn't like talking about Oregon. Says he's trying to put it behind him and move on with his life. But he did mention that he's been having dreams about those beings, dreams where they're trying to communicate something important. He always wakes up before he can understand what they're trying to say. I've been thinking about taking a road trip to Oregon. Maybe driving by Jake's old place just to see it for myself. But honestly, I'm not sure I want to know if his story is true. Some things are better left alone.
This story comes from my coworker Maria, who told it to me during one of our night shifts at the hospital. Maria's a respiratory therapist, been working nights for 15 years, and she's seen enough weird medical cases that she doesn't get rattled easily. But this story still gives her nightmares, and she made me promise not to use her last name if I ever told anyone. Maria's brother Luis works construction, specifically building cell phone towers in remote areas. It's good money but hard work, long hours in the middle of nowhere, dealing with extreme weather and difficult terrain. Luis has been doing it for about 8 years, and he's worked all over the Southwest. Nevada, Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado. He's used to isolation and weird landscapes. This happened last summer, July 2023. Luis was part of a 4-man crew contracted to build a tower about 60 miles northeast of Las Vegas, way out in the desert, where there's nothing but sagebrush and rock formations for miles in every direction. The kind of place where you can see storms coming from 50 miles away, and the nearest town is just a gas station and a casino. The crew was staying in a motel in a tiny place called Alamo, driving out to the work site every morning in their company truck. It was brutal work, temperatures hitting 115 degrees during the day, so they were starting at 5 a.m. to get as much done as possible before the heat became unbearable. According to Maria, Luis said the location felt wrong from the first day. Not dangerous exactly, but unsettling in a way he couldn't put his finger on. The desert has its own kind of silence, but this was different. Too quiet, even for Nevada. No birds, no insects, no small animals scurrying around. Just empty silence that seemed to press in on you from all sides. The work site was on top of a small mesa, maybe 200 feet above the surrounding desert floor. Good location for signal coverage, but it meant hauling all their equipment up a winding dirt road that was barely wide enough for their truck. On the first day, Luis noticed there were no plants growing on top of the mesa. Everything around it was typical high desert vegetation, scrub brush, cacti, the occasional Joshua tree. But the mesa top was just bare rock and sand, like nothing could take root there. Luis mentioned this to the crew foreman, a guy named Pete who'd been building towers for 20 years. Pete just shrugged and said some places were like that. Soil chemistry, drainage, who knows? But Luis could tell Pete was bothered by it too. Nobody said anything, but they all felt it. The first weird incident happened on day 3. Luis was operating the crane, lifting steel sections up to where 2 other guys were bolting the tower together, when he noticed something moving in his peripheral vision. He looked down at the desert floor and saw this dust devil spinning across the flat ground below them. Nothing unusual about that. Dust devils are common in the desert. But this one was moving in a straight line directly toward their mesa, and it was bigger than any dust devil Luis had ever seen. Maybe 200 feet tall and perfectly vertical, like a tornado, but made of dust and sand instead of water vapor. Luis called out to the other guys, and they all stopped work to watch this thing approach. It reached the base of their mesa and just stopped. Sat there spitting for maybe 5 minutes, then collapsed into nothing. No wind, no debris, just gone. Pete said he'd never seen anything like it. Dust devils don't just stop and collapse. They usually peter out gradually or get disrupted by obstacles. This one had vanished like someone had flipped a switch. That night at the motel, Luis looked up weather data for the area. Clear skies, minimal wind, no atmospheric conditions that would explain a dust devil that size and behavior. He started paying more attention to the sky during work hours, and he noticed other things that didn't make sense. Birds would fly toward their work site, then suddenly veer away like they'd hit an invisible wall. Sometimes Luis would see vultures circling in the distance, but they never came within a mile of the mesa. Even insects seemed to avoid the area. Luis started bringing his lunch outside during breaks, leaving crumbs and food scraps around, but nothing ever came to investigate. Not ants, not flies, nothing. The tower construction was going slower than expected. Equipment kept malfunctioning in ways that didn't make sense. Perfectly maintained tools would suddenly stop working, batteries would drain overnight even when they weren't being used, and their radio communications kept cutting out. Pete was getting frustrated because he couldn't explain the problems to the client. On day 6, Luis was working alone on top of the partially completed tower, about 60 feet up, when he heard something that made his blood run cold. A sound like singing, but not quite human. Multiple voices harmonizing in a language he didn't recognize, coming from somewhere below him. Luis looked down and didn't see anything, but the singing continued for several minutes. Beautiful but alien, like whale song mixed with a church choir. The other guys on the ground said they couldn't hear anything, which freaked Luis out even more. Why was he the only one hearing it? That's when Luis started having the dreams. Every night, the same dream. He was standing on the mesa, but instead of being empty, it was covered with these geometric patterns carved into the rock. Complex designs that hurt to look at directly, like optical illusions that made his eyes water. In the dream, there were figures moving around the patterns, tall, pale beings that glided rather than walked. Luis would wake up with a splitting headache and the taste of metal in his mouth. Maria said he called her a few times during that week, sounding increasingly stressed and sleep-deprived. She wanted him to quit the job and come home, but Louise said they were almost finished and he needed the money. Day 9 was when things got really bad. Louise was up on the tower again, installing some of the electronic equipment, when he noticed a shadow on the ground that didn't match anything around them. It was roughly circular, maybe 50 feet across, and it was moving slowly across the desert floor toward their mesa. Louise called out to Pete, who looked up and went completely white. There was nothing in the sky that could be casting that shadow. Clear blue sky, not even a cloud, but this dark patch was moving across the ground like something was blocking the sun. The shadow reached the base of the mesa and started climbing up the sides, following the contours of the rock perfectly. Louise said it was like watching liquid darkness flow uphill. When it reached the top of the mesa, Louise felt the temperature drop by at least 20 degrees, even though he was still in direct sunlight. Then the electronics went haywire. Every piece of equipment they had, radios, power tools, even Louise's digital watch, started displaying random numbers and making sounds they weren't supposed to make. The crane's computer system crashed and rebooted itself 3 times in 5 minutes. The shadow hung around for about an hour, then gradually faded away as mysteriously as it had appeared. But the equipment problems persisted for the rest of the day. Pete was on the phone with the client, trying to explain why they needed another week to finish a job that should have taken 5 days. That night, Louise had the most vivid dream yet. He was standing in the middle of those geometric patterns, and the pale beings were all around him. But this time, they were trying to communicate. Not with words, but by touching his forehead and flooding his mind with images. Louise saw the mesa as it had been thousands of years ago, not empty desert, but some kind of landing site. Ships that weren't quite ships, more like controlled energy, setting down on the carved patterns. The beings weren't from Earth, but they'd been coming here for millennia, using the mesa as a way station for journeys between stars. In the dream, Louise understood that the tower they were building was interfering with something important. The electromagnetic signals were disrupting ancient navigation systems, blocking pathways that had been in use since before human civilization. The beings weren't angry, exactly, but they were concerned. They needed the interference to stop. Louise woke up with complete clarity about what he had to do, and it scared the hell out of him. He called Maria at 3 a.m., talking fast and barely making sense. She said he sounded like he was having a breakdown, talking about ancient aliens and electromagnetic interference and how they had to stop building the tower. Maria convinced Louise to drive back to Las Vegas that morning and see a doctor. She was worried he was having some kind of heat-induced psychosis or a reaction to dehydration. But Louise said he couldn't leave until the job was finished, not because of the money, but because he needed to document what was happening. On the final day of construction, Louise brought a camera to work. He wanted proof of the weird shadows, the equipment malfunctions, anything that would validate what he'd been experiencing. The tower was nearly complete, just a few more hours of work to get all the electronics installed and tested. That's when Louise got his proof, but not in the way he expected. Around 2 p.m., with the sun directly overhead, Louise was on top of the tower making final adjustments, when he saw something that changed his life forever. Coming from the north, flying in perfect formation about 1,000 feet above the ground, were 5 objects unlike anything he'd ever seen. They weren't aircraft in any conventional sense. They looked like metallic teardrops, maybe 20 feet long, moving without any visible means of propulsion. No wings, no rotors, no exhaust. They flew in a precise V formation, moving too smoothly and too quickly to be conventional technology. Louis started recording with his phone, his hands shaking so badly he could barely keep the camera steady. The objects flew directly over the mesa, and Louis could see details that he still describes in whispers. The surface of each craft seemed to shift and flow like liquid metal, and there were no seams or joints anywhere, like they'd been grown rather than built. As the formation passed overhead, every piece of electronic equipment on the mesa shut down simultaneously. Not gradually, not with warning beeps or error messages, just instant, complete silence. Louis's phone died mid-recording, the crane stopped responding to controls. Even their truck's engine quit running. The objects continued south until they disappeared over the horizon, and then gradually their equipment started working again. Louis climbed down from the tower as fast as he could, his legs shaking. Pete and the other guys had seen it too, but none of them wanted to talk about it. They finished the tower installation in silence and drove back to Las Vegas that evening. Pete made everyone sign additional non-disclosure agreements, claiming the client had requested extra confidentiality. But Louis could tell Pete was scared. They all were. Louis quit construction work the following week. He's doing residential electrical now, jobs that keep him in populated areas. Maria says he's never been the same, jumpy, paranoid, constantly checking the sky. He won't talk about what happened in Nevada, even with family. But here's the thing that really bothers Maria. She looked up that cell tower location online, and according to FCC records, it was decommissioned 6 months after it was built. Officially, it was due to technical difficulties and environmental concerns. The tower is still there, but it's not operational. Maria thinks the beings got what they wanted. The interference stopped, and they can use their ancient landing site again. She wonders how many other construction projects get mysteriously canceled or abandoned because they're built in the wrong places. Louis still has nightmares about those pale beings, but Maria says the dreams have changed. Instead of trying to communicate, they're just watching him, like they're making sure he keeps their secret. Sometimes he wakes up with that metallic taste in his mouth, and he knows they've been visiting his dreams again. Maria asked me not to try to verify any of this story, not to look up records or contact Louis directly. She says some knowledge is too dangerous to pursue, and she wishes Louis had never told her about Nevada. But she needed to tell someone, and she figured a night shift worker would understand about seeing things that other people wouldn't believe. I think about Louis sometimes, working on houses in suburbia, always checking the sky. And I wonder how many construction workers, surveyors, and field technicians have seen things they can't explain, in places where humans aren't supposed to be. Maybe some locations are meant to stay empty, and we're just too stubborn to listen when we're told to leave.
My brother-in-law Tony told me this story over Thanksgiving dinner last year, after we'd had a few beers and the conversation turned to weird job experiences. Tony worked pipeline maintenance for BP for 12 years, mostly in Alaska, before he transferred back to the lower 48. He's the kind of guy who doesn't embellish stories. If anything, he underplays things. So when he started talking about what happened during his last winter in Prudhoe Bay, everyone at the table got quiet real fast. This was February 2022, middle of the Alaskan winter when the sun barely comes up and temperatures hit 40 below on a warm day. Tony was part of a 3-man maintenance crew working on a remote section of pipeline about 150 miles southeast of Deadhorse. They were staying in a temporary shelter, basically a glorified trailer with heavy insulation and industrial heaters, for what was supposed to be a 10-day job checking pipeline integrity and replacing some corroded sections. The crew was Tony, a veteran named Kowalski who'd been working pipelines since the 1980s, and a younger guy fresh out of technical school called Jimmy. They'd worked together before and got along well, which was important when you're stuck in a metal box together for over a week with nothing but tundra for hundreds of miles in every direction. Tony said the isolation up there is something you have to experience to understand. It's not just remote, it's like being on another planet. No trees, no hills, just endless white flatness broken up by the occasional maintenance station or equipment depot. During winter, you might not see another human being for weeks at a time. The only sounds are wind and the constant low humming of the pipeline itself. The work was routine for the first few days. They'd drive their tracked vehicle out to inspection points along the pipeline, check pressure readings, look for leaks or structural problems, then head back to the shelter for dinner and cards. The biggest excitement was usually spotting caribou or Arctic foxes, though even the wildlife seemed scarce that winter. Tony started noticing the lights on their fourth night. He was outside the shelter around 10 p.m., checking their generator, when he saw what looked like stars moving across the sky. Not satellites. These were moving too fast and changing direction in ways that satellites don't do. 3 points of light in a perfect triangle formation, gliding silently across the aurora borealis. Tony called Kowalski and Jimmy outside, but by the time they got there, the lights were gone. Tony figured it was probably military aircraft from one of the northern bases, though he'd never seen planes move like that. Kowalski just grunted and said he'd seen stranger things in Alaska, which was his standard response to pretty much everything. The next day, Tony found tracks in the snow about 200 yards from their shelter. Not animal tracks, these were perfectly round impressions, each about the size of a dinner plate, arranged in groups of 3. The weird thing was how deep they were pressed into the frozen ground. Tony tried jumping on the snow nearby and barely left a mark, but these impressions went down at least 6 inches. Jimmy wanted to take photos and measurements, but Kowalski told him to leave it alone. Said there were things in Alaska that were better left undisturbed, and he'd learned to mind his own business during his 40 years working up there. Tony got the impression Kowalski had seen those kinds of tracks before. That night, their radio equipment started acting up. They had a powerful shortwave setup for emergency communications, but it kept picking up signals that shouldn't have been there. Voices speaking in languages none of them recognized, coming through crystal clear despite being hundreds of miles from any populated area. The voices had a strange cadence, almost musical, like they were singing instead of talking. Tony tried adjusting the frequency, but the voices followed wherever he tuned. Sometimes they'd stop mid-sentence, and then resume hours later, picking up exactly where they'd left off. Jimmy recorded some of it on his phone, but when they played it back, all they could hear was static. On day 6, Tony was doing a routine inspection of a pipeline joint when he noticed something that made his skin crawl. There were scratches in the metal pipe, deep gouges that looked like claw marks. But they were too precise, too geometric to be made by any animal. They formed patterns that almost looked like writing, symbols that seemed to shift and change when he looked at them directly. Tony showed the marks to Kowalski, who went pale and told him they needed to finish the job and get out of there as soon as possible. When Tony pressed him for an explanation, Kowalski just said he'd seen similar markings on other sections of pipeline over the years, always in the most remote locations. He'd learned to file reports that mentioned unusual wear patterns, without going into detail about what they actually looked like. That evening, their tracking equipment detected something large moving across the tundra toward their position. The radar showed an object about 50 feet long, traveling at roughly 30 miles per hour in a straight line directly toward their shelter. No heat signature, no radio emissions, just a solid mass moving across the frozen ground. Tony grabbed binoculars and went outside, but he couldn't see anything in the darkness. The object on radar got within half a mile of their position, then simply vanished from the screen. Tony spent an hour scanning the area with night vision goggles, but there was nothing out there except empty tundra. Jimmy was convinced they were dealing with some kind of experimental military vehicle, maybe a prototype stealth aircraft being tested in the remote Arctic. But Tony couldn't shake the feeling that they were being studied, like lab rats in a maze. Every time he went outside, he felt eyes on him, watching from somewhere in the darkness. Day 8 was when Tony saw them. He was working alone on a section of pipeline about a mile from their shelter when movement in his peripheral vision made him look up. Standing on a ridge maybe 300 yards away were three figures, perfectly still, silhouetted against the gray sky. At first Tony thought they were other maintenance workers, though he couldn't figure out how anyone else would have gotten to such a remote location. He waved, but the figures didn't respond. Tony pulled out his binoculars and got a look that still gives him nightmares. They weren't human. They were roughly humanoid in shape but wrong in ways that made Tony's brain struggle to process what he was seeing. Too tall, maybe 8 feet high, with proportions that didn't match human anatomy. Their limbs were elongated and seemed to bend in extra places, like they had additional joints. But the worst part was their skin, if it was skin. It looked metallic, almost silver, but it moved and flowed like liquid mercury. The figures stood motionless for maybe 10 minutes, and Tony got the distinct impression they were studying him. Not with hostility, but with the kind of detached interest a scientist might show when observing an interesting specimen. Tony felt completely exposed, like they could see through him. Then, without any visible communication between them, all three figures simply faded away. Not walked away, not moved behind cover, they became translucent and disappeared like mirages. Tony packed up his equipment and drove back to the shelter as fast as the tracked vehicle would go. He told Kowalski and Jimmy what he'd seen, expecting them to think he was losing his mind from isolation and cold. But Kowalski just nodded grimly and said they were leaving first thing in the morning, job finished or not. That night, none of them slept. They took turns on watch, though none of them could explain what they were watching for. Around 3 a.m., Jimmy shook Tony awake and pointed outside. The entire area around their shelter was glowing with pale blue light, like they were sitting in the middle of a giant spotlight. But there was no source for the light, it seemed to be coming from the snow itself. The glow lasted about 20 minutes, then gradually faded away. When Tony checked their equipment the next morning, every electronic device they had showed signs of massive electromagnetic interference. Hard drives were corrupted, batteries were drained, even their mechanical watches had stopped working. They packed up and drove back to Dead Horse that morning, leaving 2 days of work unfinished. Tony filed the report citing severe weather conditions and equipment failure, which was technically true even if it wasn't the whole truth. Kowalski retired 6 months later, and Jimmy transferred to a desk job in Anchorage. Tony said he's never been back to that section of pipeline, and according to company records, maintenance in that area has been deferred indefinitely due to logistical challenges. He thinks the company knows more than they're saying about what's out there in the remote sections of Alaska. The thing that bothers Tony most is how organized and purposeful the whole experience felt. Like those beings weren't just randomly wandering around the Arctic. They were conducting some kind of systematic study, using the pipeline as a reference point to map human activity in the region. Tony wonders if they're still out there, watching and waiting, gathering information for purposes we can't even imagine. Tony made me promise not to mention his last name or try to contact his former coworkers about this story. He's got a good job with a pipeline company in Texas now, working in populated areas where the weirdest thing he might encounter is an angry landowner. But sometimes at night, when he's working late shifts, he catches himself scanning the sky for moving lights and listening for voices on the radio that shouldn't be there.
This story comes from my old college professor, Dr. Angela Reeves, who taught anthropology before she retired last year. She told it to me during office hours my senior year, after I'd written a paper about unexplained phenomena in indigenous folklore. Professor Reeves wasn't the type to share personal anecdotes, so when she started talking about her field research experience in Montana, I knew it was something she'd been carrying around for a long time. This happened in the summer of 1998, when Professor Reeves was still working on her doctoral dissertation about traditional hunting practices among Plains tribes. She'd received a grant to spend 6 weeks documenting archaeological sites in the Absaroka Beartooth Wilderness, specifically looking for evidence of ancient hunting camps and seasonal migration routes. Professor Reeves was working alone, which was unusual for that kind of research, but she'd been studying the area for 3 years and knew the terrain well. She had permits to camp in designated backcountry sites and was equipped with satellite communications for emergencies. The plan was to hike between known archaeological sites, document any new findings, and collect oral histories from tribal elders in nearby communities. The study area was about 20 miles southeast of Billings, high mountain country where the Crow tribe had hunted for centuries before white settlement. Beautiful but challenging terrain, dense forests, steep ridges, and meadows that could be paradise in summer and death traps in winter. Professor Reeves had always felt comfortable in that landscape, connected to the history and culture she was studying. She set up her base camp at a designated site near a small alpine lake, maybe 8,000 feet elevation. From there, she could day hike to several documented archaeological sites and return each evening to her tent and equipment. The first week went exactly as planned. She was finding pottery fragments, tool remnants, and fire rings that supported her thesis about seasonal hunting patterns. But Professor Reeves started noticing things that didn't fit the historical record. Stone arrangements that were too geometric to be natural, but too complex to match known Native American construction techniques. Circular patterns of rocks, each about 30 feet in diameter, scattered across high meadows where there was no evidence of permanent settlement. Professor Reeves documented the stone circles carefully, taking photos and measurements, but she couldn't find any reference to similar structures in her research. The rocks were arranged with mathematical precision, each circle containing exactly 47 stones of roughly equal size. The patterns looked almost like landing pads or some kind of ceremonial sites, but they didn't match any known tribal traditions. On her 8th day in the field, Professor Reeves was photographing one of the stone circles when she heard something that made her freeze. Singing, coming from somewhere in the forest surrounding the meadow. Multiple voices harmonizing in a language she didn't recognize, despite her extensive knowledge of regional indigenous languages. The singing was beautiful but unsettling, with tonal qualities that seemed almost electronic. Professor Reeves stood in the center of the stone circle, listening, trying to determine where the voices were coming from. The sound seemed to emanate from the trees themselves, echoing off the mountain faces in ways that made it impossible to pinpoint the source. Professor Reeves called out in English and then in Crow, identifying herself as a researcher with tribal permission to be in the area. The singing stopped immediately, leaving only the normal sounds of wind and wildlife. She waited for 20 minutes, but the voices didn't return. That evening at her camp, Professor Reeves reviewed her audio recordings from the day. She'd been using a digital recorder to document her observations, and she was hoping she'd captured some of the singing. But when she played back the files, there was nothing unusual, just her own voice describing the stone circles and normal forest sounds. Professor Reeves started having dreams that night. Vivid, detailed dreams about the stone circles being used for their intended purpose. She saw lights descending from the sky, settling into the circular patterns with perfect precision. Beings emerged from the lights, tall, graceful figures that moved with fluid coordination, like dancers performing a rehearsed routine. In the dreams, Professor Reeves understood that the stone circles were much older than any human settlement in the region. They'd been built by visitors who came to Earth periodically, using the high mountain meadows as stopping points during longer journeys. The beings weren't malevolent, but they were utterly alien, with purposes and motivations that human minds couldn't fully comprehend. Professor Reeves would wake from these dreams with detailed knowledge of complex astronomical calculations, mathematical formulas that seemed to describe the movement of celestial bodies across vast distances. She'd write down what she remembered, filling pages of her field notebook with equations that she didn't understand but somehow knew were correct. During her second week, Professor Reeves found evidence that the stone circles were still being used. Fresh disturbances in the grass within the circles, areas where the vegetation had been pressed down in geometric patterns. The grass wasn't dead, just compressed, like something had rested there with considerable weight. Professor Reeves set up motion-activated cameras around one of the circles, hoping to document whatever was creating the disturbances. The cameras were military-grade equipment, designed to capture wildlife activity in low-light conditions. She positioned them at strategic points around the circle and returned to her base camp to wait. 2 nights later, Professor Reeves was awakened by a sound like wind chimes, impossibly delicate and musical. She unzipped her tent and saw that the entire valley was filled with soft, pulsing light, not like fire or electric lighting, but something that seemed to breathe with its own rhythm. Professor Reeves grabbed her camera and hiked toward the nearest stone circle, following a path she knew by heart even in darkness. As she got closer, the light grew brighter, and she could see shapes moving within the illuminated area. Tall figures gliding between the stone arrangements, performing what looked like a complex ritual or ceremony. Professor Reeves crept to within about 50 yards of the circle and tried to photograph what she was seeing. But every time she looked through her camera viewfinder, the images were distorted, like looking through water or heat waves. She could see the beings clearly with her naked eyes, but the camera couldn't seem to focus on them properly. The ceremony continued for about an hour. Professor Reeves watched, fascinated, as the beings moved through intricate patterns around and within the stone circle. They seemed to be conducting measurements or perhaps calibrations, using devices that glowed with the same soft light that filled the valley. Then, without warning, one of the beings turned to look directly at Professor Reeves. Even from 50 yards away, she could feel its attention like a physical weight. Not threatening, but intensely curious, like it was trying to understand what she was and why she was there. The being approached her slowly, moving with that same fluid grace she'd seen in her dreams. Professor Reeves wanted to run, but she found herself frozen in place, watching as this impossible creature came within arm's reach. Up close, the being was even more alien than she'd imagined. Humanoid in basic structure, but clearly not evolved from Earth biology. Its skin had a crystalline quality, almost translucent, and its movements seemed to defy normal physics. When it reached out to touch her forehead, Professor Reeves felt a sensation like cold electricity flowing through her mind. Images flooded her consciousness of visions of Earth from space, showing the planet at different periods in its history. She saw the stone circles being constructed thousands of years ago, part of a network of landing sites that spanned multiple continents. She understood that the beings had been visiting Earth for millennia, conducting long-term studies of biological and geological development. The contact lasted only a few seconds, but Professor Reeves felt like she'd been given access to vast libraries of knowledge about astronomy, physics, and the history of life in the universe. When the being withdrew its touch, she collapsed to her knees, overwhelmed by the amount of information that had been downloaded into her mind. When Professor Reeves looked up, the beings and their lights were gone. She was alone in the dark meadow, surrounded by the stone circle, with only her racing heartbeat and the taste of ozone in the air to prove that anything had happened. Professor Reeves hiked back to her camp in a daze, her mind still processing the flood of alien knowledge. She checked her motion-activated cameras the next morning, but they'd all malfunctioned during the night. The memory cards were corrupted, and several of the devices had completely shut down despite having full batteries. Professor Reeves cut her field research short and returned to the university 2 weeks early. She told her advisor that she'd encountered unexpected complications and needed time to process her findings. But she never published her research about the stone circles, and she changed her dissertation topic to focus on more conventional archaeological evidence. Professor Reeves said she's never been back to that area of Montana, despite receiving several grants that would have funded return trips. She kept the field notebooks from that summer, filled with astronomical calculations and sketches of things she couldn't explain, but she's never shown them to anyone in the academic community. The knowledge she received during that contact has stayed with her, though. Professor Reeves said she sometimes finds herself understanding complex physics concepts that she never studied, or having insights about astronomical phenomena that haven't been discovered yet by human science. She's learned to keep these insights to herself, publishing only research that can be verified through conventional methods. Professor Reeves told me this story because she wanted someone in the next generation to know what's really out there, waiting in the remote places where humans rarely venture. She said the beings aren't hostile, but they're conducting studies that operate on timescales measured in millennia, and individual human lives are just brief flickers in their vast research project. After Professor Reeves retired, I looked up her academic publications and found references to anomalous stone arrangements in several of her papers, but she never provided detailed descriptions or exact locations. I think she was trying to document what she'd found without attracting too much attention from other researchers. Sometimes I wonder if I should organize an expedition to those Montana meadows to see if the stone circles are still there and still being used. But Professor Reeves made me promise not to go looking for things that might be better left undisturbed. Some knowledge, she said, comes with responsibilities that most people aren't prepared to handle.
My Aunt Patricia runs a bed and breakfast up in Acadia, about 15 minutes from Bar Harbor. She's been in the hospitality business for 20 years, dealt with every kind of weird guest you can imagine, so it takes a lot to rattle her. But last spring she had an experience that shook her so badly she closed the B&B for 2 weeks and seriously considered selling the property. Aunt Pat told me this story when I visited her last summer, and she made me promise not to post it online or mention the name of her business. She's worried about scaring away customers, but more than that, she's worried about attracting the wrong kind of attention. The kind of people who go looking for things that shouldn't be found. The B&B sits on about 3 acres of coastal property, with a big Victorian house that Patricia converted into guest rooms and a separate cottage where she lives. Beautiful location, pine forests, rocky coastline, views of Frenchman Bay that tourists pay hundreds of dollars a night to enjoy. Patricia bought the property in 2003 and slowly built up a reputation for quiet luxury and personal service. This incident happened in April 2023, during the slow season when Patricia usually only has 1 or 2 rooms occupied. She had a single guest that week, a marine biologist from the University of Maine who was studying tidal pool ecosystems. Nice guy named Dr. Marcus Webb, quiet and professional, the kind of guest Patricia preferred during off-season. Dr. Webb was staying in the ocean view room on the 2nd floor, and he'd mentioned to Patricia that he was particularly interested in the rocky outcroppings along her shoreline. He'd gotten permission to set up monitoring equipment to track water temperature and salinity changes during different tidal cycles. Patricia said Dr. Webb seemed normal for the first few days of his stay. He'd leave early each morning with his equipment, spend the day collecting data along the coast, then return in the evening to work on his laptop and prepare for the next day's research. Typical academic, focused, and methodical. But on his 4th day, Dr. Webb came back to the B&B in the middle of the afternoon, looking pale and shaken. Patricia was in the kitchen when she heard the front door slam, followed by heavy footsteps on the stairs. When she knocked on his door to ask if everything was okay, Dr. Webb said he wasn't feeling well and would be staying in for the rest of the day. Patricia didn't think much of it. Guests got sick sometimes, especially during Maine's unpredictable spring weather. She made some chicken soup and left it outside his door, then went about her normal routine. But that evening, she noticed Dr. Webb pacing around his room, making phone calls that seemed agitated and urgent. The next morning, Dr. Webb asked Patricia if she'd noticed any unusual activity along the coastline recently. Strange lights, unexplained sounds, anything out of the ordinary. Patricia said the only unusual thing had been the lack of seabirds. Normally the rocky outcroppings were covered with gulls and cormorants, but she'd noticed they'd been avoiding the area for the past week or so. Dr. Webb went out that day with different equipment, cameras, recording devices, what looked like some kind of electromagnetic sensor. He seemed nervous, constantly checking over his shoulder and scanning the horizon. Patricia watched him from her kitchen window, working methodically along the tide line, but staying much closer to the house than he had during his first few days. That afternoon, Patricia was hanging laundry when she heard Dr. Webb shouting from the rocky outcropping below. She looked down and saw him waving frantically, pointing out toward the water. Patricia grabbed binoculars and tried to see what had gotten him so excited, but the ocean looked normal, gray swells, a few lobster boats in the distance, nothing unusual. Dr. Webb came running up the path from the shore, carrying his equipment and talking rapidly about unidentified submerged objects and systematic monitoring patterns. He asked Patricia if she had a landline he could use, said his cell phone wasn't getting reliable service and he needed to contact his research supervisor immediately. Patricia let him use the phone in her office, and she couldn't help overhearing parts of his conversation. Dr. Webb was describing objects moving beneath the water in formation, following geometric patterns that suggested intelligence and purpose. He kept saying he needed backup equipment and additional researchers, that this was beyond anything in the literature. That evening, Patricia was washing dishes when the power went out. Not unusual during Maine storms, but the weather was clear and calm. She went to check the circuit breakers and found Dr. Webb standing at his window, staring out at the ocean with a pair of night vision binoculars. "Look at this," he whispered, handing Patricia the binoculars. "Tell me you see it too." Patricia looked through the night vision and saw something that made her stomach drop. About half a mile offshore, just below the surface of the water, were lights. Not boat lights. These were coming from underneath, arranged in a perfect grid pattern covering maybe an acre of ocean. The lights pulsed in synchronized waves, like some kind of underwater communication system. Patricia handed the binoculars back to Dr. Webb and asked what he thought they were looking at. He said he'd been monitoring similar activity for 3 days, and the patterns were becoming more complex and organized each night. Whatever was down there was responding to his presence, adjusting its behavior based on his observation schedule. The power came back on around midnight, but Patricia couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about those lights beneath the water, pulsing with alien intelligence just a few hundred yards from her house. She'd lived on this coast for 20 years and never seen anything like it. The next morning, Patricia found strange marks on the rocky shore below her property. Not damage from storms or tides. These were too precise, too geometric. Circular impressions in the granite, each about 3 feet across, arranged in rows that extended from the high tide line down into the water. The rock inside each circle had been changed somehow, turned a different color, and given a smooth, almost polished texture. Dr. Webb was ecstatic when Patricia showed him the marks. He spent the entire day photographing and measuring them, taking samples of the altered rock. He told Patricia that the marks matched patterns he'd found at 3 other locations along the Maine coast, all sites where he detected unusual underwater activity. That night, Patricia was awakened by a sound she'd never heard before, a deep thrumming that seemed to come from beneath the house itself, like a massive engine starting up somewhere underground, but more organic, almost like a heartbeat. The sound was so low frequency she felt it more than heard it, vibrating through the floorboards and up into her bones. Patricia looked out her bedroom window and saw that the entire bay was glowing. Not with reflected light, but with its own internal luminescence, like the water itself had become phosphorescent. The glow extended as far as she could see, stretching to the horizon in all directions. Dr. Webb was already outside when Patricia got downstairs, standing ankle-deep in the tide pools with his equipment. The thrumming sound had gotten louder, and Patricia could see shapes moving beneath the glowing water, large, dark forms that glided through the depths with purposeful coordination. "They're coming up," Dr. Webb called to Patricia. "I think they're trying to make contact." Patricia watched from the shore as something enormous breached the surface about 200 yards out. Not a whale, This was metallic, angular, clearly artificial. It rose silently from the water, shedding cascades of luminescent sea spray, until it hovered about 50 feet above the waves. The craft, Patricia couldn't think of any other word for it, was roughly triangular, maybe 100 feet on each side. Its surface seemed to shift and flow like liquid metal, and it emitted no sound despite its massive size. Other objects began emerging from the water around it, smaller but similar in design, until there were maybe a dozen craft hanging in the air above Frenchman Bay. Dr. Webb was recording everything, his camera flashing constantly as he documented the encounter. Patricia stood frozen on her porch, watching as beams of light descended from the craft and began scanning the coastline. When one of the beams passed over her house, she felt a tingling sensation, like mild electrical current running through her body. The encounter lasted maybe 20 minutes. The craft hovered silently, their scanning beams methodically examining the shoreline, the forest, and the human structures. Patricia had the distinct impression they were cataloging everything, creating detailed records of the coastal ecosystem and its inhabitants. Then, as suddenly as they'd appeared, the craft descended back into the water and vanished beneath the glowing surface. The bay gradually returned to its normal dark color, and the thrumming stopped. Patricia and Dr. Webb were left standing in ordinary Maine darkness, with only the sound of waves lapping against the rocks. Dr. Webb packed up and left the next morning, despite having reserved the room for another week. He was polite but clearly shaken, and he asked Patricia not to discuss what they'd witnessed with anyone. He said he was going to file reports with appropriate authorities, but he wasn't optimistic that anyone would take the encounter seriously. Patricia hasn't seen Dr. Webb since then, though she's tried to contact him several times through the university. His department said he took an indefinite leave of absence shortly after returning from his research trip, and they couldn't provide any contact information. The circular marks on the rocks are still there, though Patricia has tried to convince herself they're just natural formations she'd never noticed before. But sometimes, on clear nights, she sees lights moving beneath the water. Distant and subtle, but following those same geometric patterns Dr. Webb had documented. Patricia told me she's been thinking about selling the B&B and moving inland, somewhere far from the ocean. She doesn't feel safe knowing there's an active monitoring station, or whatever it is, operating just offshore from her property. But she's also afraid that leaving might attract unwanted attention, like fleeing would somehow mark her as a security risk. The strangest part, Patricia said, is how normal everything seems during the day. Tourists come and go, admiring the scenery and taking photos of the rocky coastline. They have no idea they're vacation spots above an alien observation post, documenting human coastal activity for purposes we can't begin to understand. Patricia made me promise not to try to visit her B&B specifically to look for signs of the underwater activity. She says the beings seem to respond to focused attention, becoming more active when they're being deliberately observed. Better to let them conduct their research in peace and hope they continue to remain non-threatening. Sometimes I look at maps of the Maine coast and wonder how many other B&Bs, fishing villages, and summer cottages are built above similar monitoring stations. Patricia thinks the entire North Atlantic might be under systematic surveillance, with human coastal communities serving as unwitting observation points for a study that's been going on for decades or centuries.
This last story comes from my hiking buddy Marcus, who's been climbing in Colorado for 15 years and knows the backcountry better than anyone I've met. He's the type of guy who does solo winter ascents of 14,000-foot peaks and thinks nothing of spending a week alone in the wilderness. But something happened to him last August that has him questioning whether he'll ever go back to the remote areas he used to love. Marcus told me this story during a climbing trip to the Tetons, but he made me wait until we were back in civilization before he'd give me all the details. Said he didn't want to talk about it while we were actually in the mountains, like discussing it might somehow attract unwanted attention. This happened in the Sangre de Cristo Range, specifically in the wilderness area near Crestone Peak. Marcus was attempting a solo traverse of several 14 airs, a technical route that would take him across about 20 miles of high alpine terrain over 4 days.
It's the kind of challenge that serious mountaineers dream about, remote, difficult, and dangerous enough that very few people attempt it. Marcus had done extensive preparation, studying topographic maps, checking weather forecasts, and caching supplies at strategic points along the route. He's obsessive about mountain safety, carries redundant navigation systems, extra food and water, emergency communication devices. The kind of preparation that keeps you alive when things go wrong at 13,000 feet above sea level. The first 2 days of the traverse went perfectly. Marcus made good time across the technical sections, found his supply caches intact, and had clear weather for navigation. He was camping at designated sites, following leave-no-trace principles, doing everything by the book. The kind of trip that reminds you why you love solo mountaineering. But on the second night, camped in a cirque below Crestone Peak, Marcus started noticing things that didn't add up. The silence was too complete, no marmot calls, no pikas chirping, none of the normal sounds you expect in high alpine environments. Even the wind seemed muted, like the air was thicker than it should be at that altitude. Marcus also noticed that his GPS readings were inconsistent. The device would show his location accurately for a few minutes, then suddenly display coordinates that placed him several miles from where he knew he was. He'd reset the device and get correct readings again, but the glitches kept happening throughout the night. Around 2 a.m., Marcus was awakened by light coming through his tent walls. Bright, white light that was clearly not coming from his headlamp or any other equipment. Marcus unzipped his tent and saw something that violated everything he knew about mountain environments. Floating about 100 feet above his campsite was a sphere of light, maybe 10 feet across, perfectly spherical and absolutely silent. The light was so bright Marcus had to squint to look at it, but it wasn't casting shadows the way a normal light source would. Everything around his campsite was evenly illuminated, like the light was coming from everywhere at once. Marcus grabbed his camera and tried to photograph the sphere, but the images came out completely white, overexposed despite proper camera settings. The sphere hovered for maybe 5 minutes, then suddenly shot straight up and disappeared into the night sky faster than any aircraft Marcus had ever seen. Marcus spent the rest of the night awake, scanning the sky and checking his equipment. His GPS was working properly again, and his other electronics seemed unaffected. But he found strange impressions in the rocky ground around his campsite, circular depressions that looked like landing marks, though nothing had actually touched down during his observation. The next morning, Marcus decided to continue the traverse despite feeling uneasy about the previous night's encounter. He'd invested too much time and effort in the expedition to turn back because of one unexplained incident. But as he hiked toward his next checkpoint, Marcus became aware that he wasn't alone in the high country. There were tracks in the few patches of soft earth along his route, not animal tracks, and definitely not boot prints from other hikers. These were perfectly round impressions, each about 6 inches across, spaced about 4 feet apart in a perfectly straight line. The tracks followed the contours of the terrain in ways that suggested whatever made them wasn't affected by normal gravity or balance limitations. Marcus photographed the tracks and tried to follow them, but they led up a near-vertical rock face that would have been impossible for any normal creature to climb. The tracks simply ended at the base of the cliff, with no sign of whatever had made them changing direction or using climbing equipment. As Marcus continued his traverse, he started feeling like he was being watched. Not the normal paranoia that comes with solo mountaineering, but a specific, focused attention that made the hair on his neck stand up. He'd catch glimpses of movement on distant ridges, always just at the edge of his peripheral vision, but when he'd stop to scan the area with binoculars, there was nothing there. Marcus reached his third campsite just before sunset, a narrow ledge about 12,500 feet up with spectacular views of the surrounding peaks. He'd been looking forward to this spot for months. It was supposed to be the highlight of the entire traverse. But as he set up his tent, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that something was fundamentally wrong with the environment around him. The air pressure felt off, like he was at sea level instead of high altitude. His altimeter readings were inconsistent, sometimes showing his correct elevation, sometimes displaying impossible readings that put him thousands of feet higher or lower than his actual position. Even his breathing felt wrong. He should have been working harder at that altitude, but he felt like he was getting more oxygen than he should. That night, Marcus was awakened by sounds coming from outside his tent. Not wind or settling equipment, but what sounded like voices having a conversation in a language he didn't recognize. The voices were clear and distinct, coming from maybe 20 feet away, but they had an odd quality that made them seem both very close and very distant at the same time. Marcus grabbed his headlamp and unzipped his tent, but there was nothing outside except empty mountain terrain. The voices stopped immediately when he emerged, leaving only the normal sounds of wind and his own breathing. But Marcus could feel presence nearby, like invisible observers watching his every movement. Marcus decided to break camp and continue hiking by moonlight, even though night travel in technical terrain is incredibly dangerous. He'd rather risk a climbing accident than spend another hour in that campsite. As he packed his gear, Marcus noticed that his tent had left no impression in the rocky ground where it had been pitched. The surface looked completely undisturbed, like nothing had ever been there. The final day of the traverse should have been a triumphant finish to an epic mountaineering achievement. Marcus was making good time toward his exit point, a trailhead where he'd left his truck 4 days earlier. But as he descended from the high alpine zone, Marcus realized that something was following him. He'd hear footsteps behind him on loose scree slopes, but when he'd turn around, there would be no one there. Rocks would clatter down from above, like someone was climbing parallel to his route, but Marcus never saw any other climbers. The sounds were too regular and purposeful to be natural rockfall, but too stealthy to be made by normal hikers. About 2 miles from his truck, Marcus stopped for a rest break and made the mistake of looking back at the route he'd just descended. Standing on a ridge maybe 300 yards above him were 3 figures, silhouetted against the bright sky. They were too far away for Marcus to make out details, but their proportions looked wrong, too tall, too thin, moving in ways that didn't match human biomechanics. Marcus waved, thinking they might be other climbers who needed assistance. But the figures didn't respond. They stood motionless for several minutes, and Marcus got the distinct impression they were studying him, analyzing his equipment and behavior with scientific detachment. Then the figures simply vanished. Not walked away, not moved behind cover, they faded out like mirages, leaving Marcus staring at an empty ridge. Marcus finished the hike to his truck in record time, constantly looking over his shoulder and fighting the urge to run. When he finally reached the trailhead, he found a note tucked under his windshield wiper, not a citation or message from other hikers, but a piece of paper covered with symbols that looked almost like mathematical equations but using characters he'd never seen before. Marcus kept the note for several weeks, trying to find someone who could translate or explain the symbols. He showed it to linguists, mathematicians, even posted photos on obscure academic forums. Nobody could identify the writing system or suggest what the symbols might mean. Eventually, the paper began deteriorating despite being kept in a protective sleeve, the symbols fading until the note was completely blank. Marcus finished telling me this story while we were driving back from the Tetons, and he made me promise not to research the specific location where his encounter occurred. He said he'd been back to other areas of the Sangre de Cristo range, but he won't go anywhere near Crestone Peak. Too many variables that don't add up, too many signs that humans aren't the only intelligence operating in those mountains. The thing that bothers Marcus most is how purposeful the whole experience felt. Like the beings weren't just randomly wandering around the high country, but conducting systematic observations of human mountaineering activity. Marcus wonders if they're studying our technology, our physical capabilities, or our psychological responses to extreme environments. Marcus told me he's been researching reports of similar encounters in other mountain ranges, and he's found patterns that suggest a coordinated monitoring program. Climbers and backcountry travelers reporting strange lights, impossible tracks, and encounters with beings that don't quite look human. Always in the most remote locations, always with witnesses who are experienced enough to know what normal mountain environments should look and feel like. Marcus made me promise not to mention specific peaks or route names when I told this story. He's worried about attracting thrill seekers who might go looking for alien encounters without understanding the real dangers involved. But he also wants people to know that we're not alone in the wilderness, and that some of the places we think of as pristine and uninhabited are actually active research sites for intelligences we can't begin to understand. Sometimes when I'm on solo climbs, I think about Marcus's story and find myself scanning the ridges for figures that might not be human. I've never seen anything unusual, but I've started paying more attention to the small details that don't quite add up: GPS glitches, unusual animal behavior, sounds that don't match their supposed sources. Maybe once you know what to look for, the signs are everywhere.